Lucas Mercer was only 8 years old when the scars on his arms turned him into a target at his new school. Every day, the whispers got louder. Freak, monster, burn boy. When the teachers failed to stop the bullying, his father, Daniel Mercer, decided to confront the bully's dad himself. He expected excuses, maybe anger, maybe even a fight. What he never expected was for the man to stare at Lucas's scars in silence and whisper, "I know those scars." And in that moment, Daniel realized the stranger standing in front of him had been connected to his family long before either of them understood why. Daniel Mercer had learned long ago that grief never truly disappeared. It simply changed shape over time. Some days it was sharp and unbearable, like broken glass buried beneath his ribs. Other days it settled quietly into the background of life, hidden beneath work schedules, grocery lists, and bedtime routines. But it was always there, waiting, especially when he looked at his son. Lucas sat at the kitchen table early Monday morning, carefully snapping tiny Lego pieces together while cereal slowly softened in his bowl. Sunlight streamed through the apartment window, catching the pale burn scars that climbed along the boy's forearms like faded lightning. At 8 years old, Lucas had already survived more pain than most people experienced in a lifetime. 5 years earlier, a fire had ripped through Riverside Heights apartments in the middle of the night. Daniel still remembered the smoke choking the hallway, the screams, the unbearable heat. He remembered searching desperately for Olivia while firefighters dragged him outside. He remembered the moment someone placed Lucas into his arms, alive, and the moment he realized Olivia never made it out. "Dad?" Daniel blinked, pulled back into the present. "You're doing the stare thing again." Lucas gave him a small smile. Daniel forced himself to smile back. "Sorry, buddy. Big day today." Lucas's smile faded slightly. Westbrook Elementary. New school, new district, new start. At least that was what Daniel kept telling himself. His recent promotion at the insurance company meant a better salary and safer neighborhood. But moving across the city also meant Lucas had to leave behind the small group of classmates who had slowly grown used to his scars. Kids at Westbrook weren't used to them yet. Daniel noticed it immediately during the first week. The stares, the whispering, parents pulling their children a little closer during pickup, children asking uncomfortable questions loud enough for Lucas to hear. What happened to his arms? Did he touch fire? Does it hurt? Lucas tried pretending it didn't bother him, but Daniel knew better. Children could survive terrible things physically while quietly breaking apart inside. The worst of it started with Mason Cole. Mason was tall for his age, loud, confident, and cruel in the careless way some children became when pain lived in places they didn't understand. At recess, he called Lucas Burn Boy. At lunch, he asked if Lucas melted when it rained. Other kids laughed because they wanted Mason's approval more than they cared about Lucas's feelings. Each day, Lucas grew quieter. He stopped raising his hand in class, stopped wearing short sleeves, stopped asking to go to the playground after school. Then, 2 weeks after school started, Daniel found Lucas sitting awake in bed long after midnight. The room glowed softly with dinosaur nightlights across the walls. Lucas stared down at his scarred arms. "Buddy?" Daniel said gently. Lucas hesitated before speaking. "Dad." His voice was painfully small. "Do I look like a monster?" Daniel felt his heart crack cleanly in half. And in that moment, he realized the move that was supposed to give them a better life might be destroying his son instead. Daniel barely slept after Lucas asked if he looked like a monster. The question followed him through the entire night, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Even sitting at his desk the next morning, staring blankly at spreadsheets inside his downtown office, All he could hear was Lucas's tiny voice, trembling in the dark. "Do I look like a monster?" By noon, Daniel had already made up his mind. He left work early and drove straight to Westbrook Elementary. The school secretary gave him a sympathetic smile when he asked to speak with Lucas's teacher. "Ms. Bennett is expecting you," she said softly. That alone worried him. Inside the classroom, colorful posters covered the walls, while tiny desks sat neatly arranged in rows. Ms. Bennett looked exhausted despite her warm expression. She motioned for Daniel to sit down. "Mr. Mercer," she began carefully, "I'm very glad you came." Daniel leaned forward immediately. "My son is being bullied." Ms. Bennett sighed quietly. "Yes, I'm aware there have been some issues between Lucas and another student." "Some issues?" Daniel repeated sharply. "My son thinks he's a monster." Her face fell. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize things had escalated that far." Daniel rubbed a hand across his face, trying to stay calm. "Lucas used to love school. Now he pretends he's sick every morning. He barely talks anymore. Whatever is happening in this classroom, it's hurting him." Ms. Bennett nodded slowly. "The student involved is Mason Cole. He's had behavioral problems since the beginning of the year. Anger issues, fighting, defiance." She hesitated. "There are some difficulties at home." Daniel almost laughed bitterly. "So that gives him permission to torment my son?" "No, absolutely not," she said quickly. "I've spoken to Mason several times. I've assigned lunch detention. I've contacted the principal." "Has any of it helped?" The silence answered for her. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat across from Principal Carter inside a polished office filled with educational awards and motivational posters. The woman spoke confidently, folding her hands across the desk. "We take bullying very seriously at Westbrook Elementary." Daniel stared at her evenly. "With respect, it doesn't feel that way." Principal Carter maintained her professional smile. "We're implementing restorative intervention strategies. Mason will begin peer mediation sessions next week, and we're organizing a school-wide assembly focused on inclusion and emotional learning." Daniel felt frustration burning hotter with every carefully rehearsed sentence. "My son doesn't need a poster about kindness," he said. "He needs someone to stop this before it destroys him." The principal's expression softened slightly. "I understand your concern, Mr. Mercer." "No," Daniel thought bitterly, "you really don't." For a few days, things seemed quieter. Lucas even came home smiling once after a science lesson about volcanoes. Daniel allowed himself a tiny flicker of hope. Then Friday happened. Lucas climbed silently into Daniel's car after school, clutching something bundled tightly in his lap. Daniel immediately noticed the red rims around his son's eyes. "What happened?" Lucas slowly unfolded the fabric. His favorite hoodie, the blue dinosaur one Olivia had bought him before she died, was ripped straight down the middle. Daniel's stomach dropped. "Mason grabbed it during recess," Lucas whispered. "He said monsters don't deserve cool clothes." For several seconds, Daniel couldn't speak. He remembered Olivia laughing while Lucas tried on that hoodie years ago, stomping around the apartment, pretending to be a T-Rex. It was one of the few physical memories Lucas still had of his mother, and now it hung, torn apart in his shaking hands. That night, Lucas had another nightmare. Daniel heard the screaming from down the hall and rushed into the bedroom. Lucas sat upright in bed, gasping for air. "The fire!" he cried. "Dad, I couldn't find Mom!" Daniel pulled him close, holding him tightly while the boy trembled against his chest. Something inside Daniel hardened then. The school had failed. The teachers had failed. The principal had failed. And if nobody else was willing to protect his son, he would do it himself. Rain hammered against Daniel Mercer's windshield as he drove across the city Saturday morning. The storm matched the anger boiling inside him. Lucas was spending the weekend at his grandmother's house, giving Daniel time to handle adult stuff, as he'd quietly put it the night before. The words had crushed him more than they should have. An 8-year-old boy shouldn't already understand when adults were carrying burdens too heavy to share. But Lucas did, because pain had forced him to grow up too fast. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the GPS directed him deeper into an older neighborhood on the east side of town. Small, ranch-style homes lined the streets, most with peeling paint, cracked driveways, and neglected lawns. Finally, he pulled up in front of a faded gray house with an overgrown yard. The Cole residence. For several moments, Daniel sat motionless in the car. He had imagined this confrontation 100 different ways during the past 24 hours. Maybe Mason's father would deny everything. Maybe he'd defend his son. Maybe the conversation would explode into shouting. Part of Daniel almost wanted that, because anger felt easier than helplessness. He climbed out of the car and walked toward the front porch, while cold rain soaked through his jacket. A rusted wind chime rattled softly overhead. Then he knocked. Footsteps approached slowly from inside. The door opened. Daniel found himself staring at a man who looked far older than he probably was. Nathan Cole stood at least 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, but thinner than he should have been. Gray streaked through his dark hair, and exhaustion hollowed the space beneath his eyes. Faint scars marked one side of his neck and disappeared beneath the collar of his t-shirt. But it was the way he moved that caught Daniel's attention. Careful. Measured. Like someone living with old injuries that never completely healed. Yes? Nathan asked cautiously. Daniel forced himself to stay focused. Are you Mason Cole's father? Nathan nodded once. I am. And you are? Daniel Mercer. My son is Lucas Mercer. The moment Lucas's name left his mouth, something changed in Nathan's expression. Recognition, then resignation. A weary sadness settled across his face. Oh, he said quietly. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. I think I know why you're here. Daniel entered reluctantly. The inside of the house was neat but sparse. Old furniture, bare walls. A few framed family photos rested on a shelf near the living room. In the older pictures, a woman stood beside Nathan and Mason, smiling brightly. In the recent photos, she was gone. Can I get you coffee? Nathan asked. This isn't a social visit, Daniel replied coldly. Nathan nodded slightly. No, I suppose it isn't. Daniel's restraint finally snapped. Your son has been tormenting mine for weeks, he said sharply. He calls him names, humiliates him in front of other kids. My son's afraid to go to school because of Mason. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly. I know there have been incidents. Incidents? Daniel interrupted. Lucas came home asking if he looked like a monster. The words hit Nathan visibly hard. Daniel saw guilt flash across the man's face. He tore apart my son's favorite hoodie yesterday, Daniel continued. Do you understand what this is doing to him? Nathan rubbed a hand across his jaw slowly. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I truly am. The sincerity in his voice caught Daniel off guard, but his anger remained. Sorry isn't enough. No, Nathan admitted. It isn't. Silence filled the room for a moment, heavy and uncomfortable. Then Nathan spoke again. Mason's been struggling lately. Ever since... He stopped himself. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. Daniel crossed his arms. Then stop him. Nathan looked exhausted suddenly. Not defensive. Not angry. Just tired. I've been trying. Daniel was about to respond when Nathan frowned slightly. You mentioned your son being called a monster because of scars. Daniel stiffened instantly. Yes. Nathan's expression shifted strangely. What kind of scars? The question felt oddly personal. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Burn scars, he answered carefully. From a fire when he was 3. Nathan went completely still. The color slowly drained from his face, and when he looked back up at Daniel, his eyes were filled with something dangerously close to fear. Nathan swallowed hard. Could I see them? For a moment, Daniel simply stared at Nathan. Rain tapped softly against the living room windows, while the silence between them grew heavier by the second. Why? Daniel asked carefully. Why do you want to see my son's scars? Nathan looked shaken, not curious, not judgmental. Shaken. Please, he said quietly. I need to know. Every instinct told Daniel to refuse. His protective walls rose immediately. Lucas had spent years being stared at by strangers, whispered about by children, pitied by adults. Daniel hated exposing him to one more set of eyes. But something about Nathan's expression stopped him. The man looked terrified. Slowly, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through pictures until he found one from the previous summer at the beach. Lucas stood barefoot near the water, smiling shyly at the camera, sunlight stretching across the healed burn scars on his arms and shoulder. Daniel handed over the phone. Nathan took it carefully. The second he saw the photo, all the color drained from his face. His hand began trembling. Oh my God, he whispered. Daniel's stomach tightened. Nathan stared at the image for several long seconds before looking up again, his eyes filled with something raw and haunted. I know those scars. The words hit Daniel like ice water. What does that mean? Nathan swallowed hard. What was your wife's name? Daniel frowned immediately. What? Your wife, Nathan repeated quietly. The one who died in the fire. What was her name? Daniel's pulse began pounding. Olivia, he answered slowly. Olivia Mercer. Nathan closed his eyes briefly, like the name itself physically hurt him. And the fire, he continued, voice barely above a whisper. It happened 5 years ago. Riverside Heights Apartments. Daniel stood up so quickly the coffee table rattled. How do you know that? Nathan looked at him with unbearable sadness. Because I was there. Daniel froze. What? Nathan carefully set the phone down on the table. I was the firefighter who carried your son out of that building. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Daniel stared at the man in complete disbelief. No, he said automatically. No, that's impossible. But even as he spoke, memories began crashing into him. The scars on Nathan's neck, the careful way he moved, the exhaustion in his eyes. You're lying, Daniel whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Nathan shook his head slowly. My full name is Nathaniel Cole. Back then, everybody called me Nate. His voice cracked slightly. I was Engine 14. Daniel felt his knees weaken. The firefighter, the man he had spent 5 years imagining. The stranger who had rushed into flames while everyone else ran out. Daniel remembered the hospital afterward. Doctors speaking in hushed voices, police officers asking questions, someone mentioning the firefighter who'd been injured during the rescue. A ceiling collapse. Broken ribs. Burns. You, Daniel struggled to breathe properly. You saved Lucas. Nathan looked down at his scarred hands. Yes. The single word carried years of pain inside it. Daniel sank slowly back into the chair. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Nathan rolled up one sleeve. Angry burn scars stretched across his forearm and disappeared beneath his shoulder. The second floor collapsed while I was carrying him down, he explained quietly. Part of the hallway ceiling came down on us. Daniel stared silently. Nathan continued. The smoke was too thick by the time we reached your apartment. I heard your son crying first. His jaw tightened painfully. I found him trapped beside the bedroom doorway. Daniel felt tears burning behind his eyes. And Olivia? He asked softly. Nathan's face crumpled slightly. For the first time since Daniel arrived, The man looked completely broken. "I tried," Nathan whispered. "God, I tried." Rain thundered harder outside. Nathan leaned forward, elbows resting against his knees, as if the memory itself physically weighed him down. The building became unstable fast. My captain ordered evacuation after the second collapse. His voice shook now. "I had enough time to make one trip." Daniel's chest tightened. "One trip?" Nathan nodded slowly, unable to meet his eyes. "I could save your son," he whispered. "Or I could go back for your wife." The words shattered something inside the room. Daniel couldn't breathe. For 5 years, he had imagined that night 1,000 different ways, but he had never once imagined sitting face to face with the man forced to make that impossible choice. The rain outside gradually softened into a steady drizzle, but inside the coal house, the air remained painfully heavy. Daniel sat motionless, staring at Nathan as the truth settled between them. 5 years. For 5 years, Daniel had carried gratitude toward a nameless firefighter he never thought he would meet. At the same time, he had carried anger at fate, at the fire, at the unbearable unfairness of losing Olivia. Now both emotions sat directly across from him, wearing the face of a broken man. Nathan rubbed his trembling hands together slowly. "I used to replay that night every single day," he admitted quietly. "Every morning, every night, every time I closed my eyes." Daniel swallowed hard, but said nothing. Nathan continued staring at the floor. "I kept thinking maybe if I'd moved faster, maybe if I'd ignored evacuation orders, maybe if I'd searched one more room." His voice cracked. "Maybe your wife would still be alive." Daniel felt a sharp ache spread through his chest. "The fire chief told me afterward that she was already unconscious from smoke inhalation," he said carefully. "They said she probably never—" "But I didn't know that then," Nathan interrupted softly. Silence returned. Nathan leaned back against the couch, exhaustion washing over him. "The injuries healed eventually," he said. "Mostly." He rolled up his sleeve farther, revealing thick scars that stretched toward his shoulder. Broken ribs, torn muscles, second-degree burns. He gave a humorless laugh. "Turns out bodies heal a lot easier than minds do." Daniel noticed the empty beer bottles sitting in a recycling bin near the kitchen doorway. Suddenly, certain things made sense. "The fire department?" Daniel asked quietly. "You left?" Nathan nodded. "At first, they put me on medical leave. Then I tried coming back." His jaw tightened painfully. "But every time an alarm went off, I froze." Daniel listened carefully. "I started having panic attacks inside the truck. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think." Nathan stared blankly ahead. "I'd look at smoke, and suddenly I was back inside Riverside Heights, hearing the building crack above me." PTSD. Daniel had read enough about trauma over the years to recognize it immediately. "I started drinking after shifts," Nathan admitted. "Then before shifts. Then all the time." His voice lowered even more. "My wife tried to help for a while." Daniel glanced toward the family photos again. "The woman in the pictures?" Nathan nodded slowly. "Rebecca." A sad smile crossed his face briefly before disappearing. "She kept saying I survived the fire physically, but never came home emotionally." Daniel felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. "What happened?" Nathan exhaled shakily. "She left 2 years ago." The words landed with quiet devastation. "Mason took it hard," Nathan continued. "Harder than I realized." For the first time since arriving, Daniel began seeing something beyond the angry father of a bully. He saw a man drowning. "Mason blames me," Nathan said softly, "for losing my job, for the drinking, for his mother leaving." He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "And honestly, Maybe he's not completely wrong. Daniel immediately shook his head. No. Nathan looked up in surprise. You saved my son. I failed your wife. You saved my son, Daniel repeated firmly. Nathan stared at him silently. Daniel leaned forward. Listen to me carefully. Lucas is alive because of you. Every laugh he's ever had, every birthday, every dinosaur obsession, every single moment of his life exists because you carried him out of that building. Nathan's eyes filled with tears he clearly hated showing. But Olivia would have wanted you to save him, Daniel said quietly. That seemed to break something inside Nathan. He covered his face with one hand as his shoulders shook once. I was supposed to save everyone, he whispered hoarsely. Daniel's throat tightened painfully. Firefighters were trained to rescue people, but nobody trained them how to survive the guilt afterward. For several long moments, only the sound of rain filled the room. Then Nathan lowered his hand slowly. There's something else you should know, he said. Daniel frowned slightly. What? Nathan hesitated. Mason doesn't know any of this. Daniel blinked. He doesn't know? Nathan shook his head. He knows I used to be a firefighter. He knows I got hurt during a fire. His expression darkened with shame. But I never told him about Lucas, or your wife, or the choice I had to make. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. So while my son was being bullied for surviving the fire, Nathan closed his eyes. My son had no idea he was tormenting the child who nearly died in his father's arms. The realization hit both men like another wave of grief. Then Nathan looked at Daniel with quiet desperation. I need to fix this. Nathan sat quietly for several seconds after speaking. I need to fix this. The desperation in his voice was impossible to ignore. Daniel studied him carefully across the dim living room. When he first arrived at the Cole house, anger had consumed him completely. He came expecting excuses from an uncaring father. Instead, he found a man carrying enough guilt to crush someone twice his size. How? Daniel finally asked. Nathan exhaled slowly. By telling Mason the truth. Daniel hesitated. You think that'll change anything? I don't know, Nathan admitted honestly. But he deserves to understand what he's done. Before Daniel could answer, Nathan stood up slowly and called toward the hallway. Mason, come downstairs, please. No response. Nathan's jaw tightened slightly. Mason. Now, a door creaked upstairs a few seconds later. Heavy footsteps followed. Then Mason appeared at the bottom of the staircase, wearing a wrinkled hoodie and an annoyed expression. The moment he saw Daniel sitting in the living room, his face immediately hardened with defensiveness. I didn't do anything, he muttered automatically. Nathan's voice remained calm but firm. Sit down. Mason hesitated before dropping onto the recliner across from them. He folded his arms tightly across his chest. What now? Nathan sat opposite his son, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. This is Mr. Mercer, he said carefully. Lucas's father. Mason avoided Daniel's eyes. I know. Nathan studied his son for a long moment before speaking again. Do you know why he's here? Silence. Then Mason shrugged. Because Lucas cries about everything. Daniel felt anger flare instantly, but Nathan spoke before he could. No, Nathan said sharply. He's here because you've been cruel. Mason rolled his eyes slightly. It was just jokes. No, Nathan repeated, firmer this time. It wasn't. The room fell silent. Nathan took a slow breath. Do you know where Lucas got those scars? Mason shrugged again, though less confidently now. He was in some fire or something. Nathan nodded once. Yes, he was. Something in his father's tone finally made Mason look up properly. Nathan's eyes looked distant now, trapped somewhere years away. I was there that night. Mason frowned. What? Nathan swallowed hard. The apartment fire. Riverside Heights. His voice grew quieter. I was one of the firefighters who responded. Confusion crossed Mason's face. Daniel watched realization slowly begin forming, piece by piece. Nathan continued carefully. The little boy I carried out of that building was Lucas. The color drained from Mason's face instantly. No, he whispered. Nathan nodded. Yes. Mason looked at Daniel in disbelief before turning back toward his father. You saved him? I did. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Nathan rubbed his scarred hands together unconsciously. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. Parts of the building were collapsing while we searched for survivors. His voice shook slightly. I found Lucas trapped inside the apartment. Mason stared silently. Nathan continued. He was only 3 years old. Daniel saw Mason's tough expression beginning to crack. He was crying for his mom, Nathan whispered, even while the smoke filled the room. Mason swallowed hard. And the scars? He asked quietly. Nathan looked directly at him. Those scars are proof that Lucas survived something most adults wouldn't survive. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Then Nathan asked the question that changed everything. When you called him a monster, his voice tightened painfully. Did you ever stop to think about what he lived through? Mason's breathing became uneven. I didn't know, he whispered. I know you didn't, Nathan replied softly. But that doesn't erase what you did. Daniel watched Mason's eyes begin filling with tears. The boy suddenly looked much younger than before. Not cruel, just lost. Nathan leaned back slowly. For 5 years, he said quietly, I blamed myself for not saving enough people that night. Daniel lowered his eyes. And now, Nathan continued, voice breaking, I find out my own son became the reason that little boy was suffering all over again. Mason's face crumpled completely. I'm sorry, he whispered. Nathan didn't speak. Mason looked toward Daniel then, tears sliding down his cheeks. I didn't know, he repeated helplessly. I swear I didn't. Daniel studied the trembling child sitting across from him. For the first time, he didn't see a bully. He saw another wounded kid drowning in pain he didn't understand. Finally, Daniel spoke quietly. Mason, Lucas doesn't need people feeling sorry for him. Mason wiped his face quickly. He doesn't? No, Daniel shook his head. He needs people willing to see him for who he really is. Mason looked confused. Daniel's voice softened. He's kind, smart, funny, obsessed with dinosaurs and Legos. A faint smile touched his face. And despite everything he's survived, he still tries to believe people are good. Nathan lowered his head slightly. Daniel looked directly at Mason. If you really want to fix this, don't just apologize. Mason sniffled. Then what do I do? Daniel answered gently. Be better. Monday morning arrived, gray and cold. Daniel stood beside his car in the Westbrook Elementary parking lot, while Lucas tightened the straps of his backpack nervously. Usually, Daniel only walked him to the front entrance before heading to work. But today felt different, important. Lucas stared at the school building with visible hesitation. Dad, he said quietly. Daniel crouched beside him. What's up, buddy? Lucas shifted uneasily. What if Mason's mean again? The question sliced through Daniel's chest. For weeks, Lucas had walked into this building carrying fear no child should feel at school. Fear of laughter, fear of whispers, fear of being looked at like he didn't belong. Daniel placed a hand gently on his shoulder. I don't think he will be, he said honestly. But if anything happens, you come get me immediately, okay? Lucas nodded uncertainly. Together they walked toward the front doors. Children rushed through the hallways laughing loudly, backpacks bouncing behind them. Teachers greeted students while parents hurried off to work. Then Daniel spotted Nathan standing near the entrance. Beside him stood Mason. The boy looked pale and unusually quiet. Lucas noticed them too and instinctively moved closer to Daniel. "That's him," he whispered. "I know." Nathan gave Daniel a small nod as they approached. The tension between them from days earlier had changed into something quieter now. Still painful, but no longer hostile. Mason stared awkwardly at the floor. Nathan gently placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Go ahead," he encouraged softly. Mason swallowed hard before stepping forward. Lucas looked confused. Mason took another shaky breath. "I'm really sorry." The hallway noise around them suddenly felt distant. Lucas blinked in surprise. "I shouldn't have called you names," Mason continued quickly, "or messed with your clothes, or made fun of your scars." His voice trembled. "I was being horrible." Lucas stared silently. Daniel could practically feel the boy trying to process what was happening. Mason glanced nervously toward his father before continuing. "My dad told me about the fire." Lucas frowned slightly. "The fire?" Nathan slowly stepped forward then, kneeling carefully until he was eye level with Lucas. His expression softened completely. "Lucas," he said gently, "there's something I should have told you a long time ago." Daniel watched Lucas study the stranger's scarred face. Something faint flickered across the boy's expression. Recognition. Nathan's voice shook slightly. "I was the firefighter who carried you out of Riverside Heights." Lucas froze. For several seconds, he simply stared. Daniel felt his own throat tighten, watching the moment unfold. "You," Lucas whispered softly. Nathan nodded. "I remember you very clearly." Lucas looked overwhelmed. Tiny, fragmented memories had always haunted him since childhood. Smoke, heat, strong arms carrying him through darkness. A voice promising he would be okay. Now that voice had a face. "You saved me?" Lucas asked quietly. Nathan smiled sadly. "You were very brave." Lucas stared at the scars along Nathan's neck and arms. "You got hurt too." Nathan looked surprised for a second before giving a small nod. "A little." Lucas lowered his eyes. For the first time since the fire, Daniel saw his son looking at another person with scars similar to his own. Not with shame, with understanding. Mason stepped closer again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "If I knew, I never would have." Lucas interrupted softly. "My dad says people should still be kind, even if they don't know somebody's story." Mason looked like he might cry again. "I know," he whispered. "I'm trying to be better." The hallway remained strangely quiet around them now. A few teachers watched discreetly from nearby classrooms, sensing something emotional unfolding. Then Mason blurted suddenly, "My dad said you like Legos." Lucas blinked. "You like Legos too?" Mason nodded quickly. "I have the giant Jurassic World set at home. And the Millennium Falcon." Lucas's eyes widened instantly. "You have the big Falcon?" Daniel almost laughed from relief at the sudden excitement in his son's voice. For the first time in weeks, Lucas looked like a normal 8-year-old boy again. Mason nodded eagerly. "Yeah, it took forever to build. I've always wanted that one," Lucas admitted quietly. Mason hesitated only a second. "You could come see it sometime." Lucas glanced uncertainly at Daniel. Daniel smiled softly. "I think that sounds okay." Something changed then. Not all at once. Not magically, but slowly, carefully. The wall around Lucas's heart cracked open, just enough to let hope back in. Saturday evening carried the warm smell of rain and fresh garlic through the Mercer apartment. Daniel stood at the stove, stirring spaghetti sauce while trying not to overthink the strange reality unfolding in his life. 1 week earlier, he had driven to Nathan Cole's house furious and ready for war. Now Nathan and Mason were coming over for dinner. Life could change direction so suddenly, it almost made a person dizzy. The knock at the door came right as Lucas raced down the hallway holding 2 dinosaur figures in his hands. "They're here!" Daniel smiled despite himself. "Easy, buddy." Lucas yanked open the door before Daniel could reach it. Mason stood there awkwardly, holding a Lego box beneath one arm, while Nathan waited behind him carrying a pie from a local bakery. For a brief moment, all 4 of them simply stood there, unsure how to begin this new version of their lives. Then Lucas grinned. "You brought Legos." Mason smiled back immediately. "Told you I would." Within seconds, the boys disappeared into Lucas's bedroom, arguing excitedly about whether the T-Rex or the Indominus Rex was cooler. Nathan watched them go with quiet disbelief. "I haven't heard him laugh like that in a long time," he admitted softly. Daniel took the pie from his hands. Same with Lucas. They stood awkwardly in the kitchen for a second before Daniel gestured toward the table. "Come in." Dinner felt surprisingly normal. The boys talked nonstop about dinosaurs, spaceships, and video games, while Nathan and Daniel exchanged cautious conversation between bites of pasta. Slowly, the tension eased. For the first time in years, Daniel realized how lonely he and Lucas had become after Olivia's death. Grief had isolated them quietly from the world. People either pitied them too much or avoided talking about the fire entirely. But Nathan understood, not from sympathy, from experience. After dinner, Lucas dragged Mason into the living room to show him his growing dinosaur collection, while Daniel and Nathan cleaned dishes together. "You don't have to help," Daniel said. Nathan shrugged lightly. "Old firefighter habit. We clean everything." Daniel laughed softly before he could stop himself. The sound surprised both of them. A few minutes later, Lucas wandered back into the kitchen. "Nathan?" The boy still seemed unsure what to call him. Nathan immediately turned toward him. "Yeah, buddy?" Lucas hesitated. "Can you tell me about the fire?" The kitchen fell silent instantly. Daniel looked at Nathan carefully. They had discussed this possibility earlier in the week, but hearing the question aloud still tightened something inside his chest. Nathan crouched slightly so he was closer to Lucas's eye level. "Are you sure you want to hear about it?" Lucas nodded slowly. "I think so." Nathan glanced briefly toward Daniel, who gave a small, approving nod. So Nathan began. He kept his voice calm and gentle, carefully shaping the terrifying memory into something an 8-year-old could safely carry. He explained how firefighters worked together, how smoke detectors helped save lives, how brave Lucas had been. "You were really scared," Nathan said softly, "but you kept listening to me anyway." Lucas stared at him intently. "Were you scared too?" Nathan smiled sadly. "Absolutely." Lucas blinked in surprise. "But firefighters aren't supposed to be scared." Nathan shook his head. "That's not true." His voice remained warm and steady. "Being brave doesn't mean you aren't scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are." Lucas seemed to think carefully about that. Then, slowly, he rolled up one sleeve of his shirt. The healed burn scars stretched pale beneath the kitchen light. "Do they still look bad?" he asked quietly. Daniel's heart clenched. Nathan studied the scars carefully for several long seconds. Not with pity, not with discomfort, with respect. Finally, he looked back at Lucas. "You know what I see when I look at those scars?" Lucas shook his head. "I see proof that you survived." Lucas remained silent. Nathan gently touched one of the faded marks along the boy's arm. "These are battle scars," he said softly. "The kind warriors carry after they win." "A warrior?" Lucas whispered. Nathan smiled. "The strongest one I know." For the first time since the fire 5 years earlier, Daniel watched his son look at his scars without shame, and in that moment, something inside all of them began healing together. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and for the first time in years, Daniel Mercer began noticing signs of life returning to places that had once felt permanently frozen. It started with small things. Lucas stopped hiding his arms beneath long sleeves. At first, Daniel barely noticed. One morning, his son simply walked into the kitchen, wearing a short-sleeved dinosaur t-shirt without hesitation. Sunlight stretched across the pale scars on his arms, but Lucas no longer tugged nervously at the fabric, trying to cover them. Daniel nearly cried into his coffee. At school, things changed too. Children still stared sometimes. Some asked awkward questions. But now, before Daniel could worry, Mason usually stepped in first. "He survived a fire," Mason would say proudly. "Those scars mean he's tougher than all of us." Coming from anyone else, it might have sounded strange. Coming from the former bully who once tormented Lucas, it carried real weight. And somehow, the other kids listened. One afternoon, Daniel arrived early for pickup and spotted Lucas sitting beneath a tree near the playground, with Mason and several other boys crowded around him. Lucas was talking animatedly while using his hands to describe something enormous. "A T-Rex could totally beat a Spinosaurus," he insisted. "No way," another boy argued. Mason shook his head dramatically. "You guys are missing the point. The Indominus Rex would destroy both of them." Lucas laughed loudly, not the small, cautious laugh Daniel had grown used to over the years. A real one, open, fearless. The sound nearly stopped him in his tracks. For months, Daniel had focused so hard on protecting his son that he forgot something important. Lucas didn't just need safety, he needed childhood. Meanwhile, Nathan fought his own battles quietly. Some days were still bad. Daniel noticed the exhaustion in Nathan's face whenever nightmares stole his sleep. He noticed the tension whenever sirens echoed somewhere nearby. Trauma didn't disappear overnight, but Nathan had finally stopped facing it alone. 3 nights a week, he attended meetings at Hope Recovery Group. Other nights, he met with a therapist who specialized in PTSD among first responders. At first, Nathan barely spoke during sessions. Then slowly, painfully, he started talking about Riverside Heights, about Olivia, about the guilt, about carrying a screaming child through collapsing smoke while believing someone else was dying behind him. For the first time in years, he stopped calling himself a failure. Daniel helped where he could. Sometimes that meant sitting silently beside Nathan during late-night coffee after difficult therapy sessions. Sometimes it meant reminding him that healing wasn't weakness, and sometimes it simply meant showing up. Nathan did the same for Daniel. One evening, after the boys fell asleep during a movie marathon, Nathan found Daniel quietly staring at an old framed photograph of Olivia on the bookshelf. "You still talk to her?" Nathan asked gently. Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Nathan nodded like he understood perfectly. "I talk to people I couldn't save, too." Daniel looked down for a moment. "I spent years angry at the world," he admitted quietly. "At the fire, at myself, at everybody who still had normal lives." He exhaled slowly. "I didn't realize how alone Lucas and I had become." Nathan leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. "Pain isolates people," he said, "especially men. We're taught to carry it quietly until it destroys us." Daniel gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Sounds familiar." By spring, Nathan had been sober nearly 4 months. His hands no longer trembled constantly. The darkness beneath his eyes had softened slightly. He even started working part-time with the school district, teaching fire safety workshops for elementary students. Watching him stand in front of classrooms again nearly brought Daniel to tears. Nathan still carried scars. All of them did, but now those scars no longer felt like chains tying them to the worst moments of their lives. They had become reminders, proof of survival, proof that broken people could still rebuild themselves, and perhaps most importantly, proof that healing became possible the moment people stopped suffering alone. 1 year later, Daniel Mercer stood in his backyard watching two boys race across the grass with plastic dinosaurs in their hands. "Run!" Mason shouted dramatically. "The volcano's exploding!" Lucas laughed so hard he nearly tripped over the garden hose. "No fair! You made the volcano too close." The late afternoon sun stretched golden light across the yard while the boys disappeared behind the swing set, arguing loudly about which dinosaur would survive lava the longest. Daniel smiled quietly to himself. A year ago, Lucas had dreaded walking into school. Now he ran toward life again. The change still felt miraculous sometimes. Not because the scars had disappeared, but because the shame attached to them finally had. Lucas no longer hid beneath hoodies or long sleeves. He answered questions confidently now whenever curious classmates asked about his arms. "House fire," he would explain simply. "I survived." And every single time, Mason stood beside him like a bodyguard, not out of guilt anymore, out of love. Nathan stepped onto the back porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "Thought you might need this," he said. Daniel accepted the drink gratefully. "Thanks." For a while, they simply watched the boys play. Nathan looked healthier now than Daniel had ever seen him. Sobriety had returned steadiness to his hands and warmth to his expression. Though traces of pain still lingered in his eyes sometimes, the emptiness that once lived there was gone. 3 months earlier, the school district officially hired him as a full-time fire safety coordinator. Now he traveled between schools, teaching emergency preparedness and speaking openly about trauma recovery for first responders. Daniel couldn't think of anyone better for the job. "You know what's strange?" Nathan said quietly. "What?" "I spent years believing Riverside Heights was the moment my life ended." Daniel glanced toward him. Nathan stared out at the yard thoughtfully. "I thought I failed that night," he admitted. "I thought carrying Lucas out of that building wasn't enough, because I couldn't save Olivia too." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Even now, hearing Olivia's name still hurt, but it no longer destroyed him. Nathan continued softly. "Then somehow, everything led here." Lucas and Mason were now attempting to build a dinosaur fortress out of lawn chairs and cardboard boxes. It looked structurally disastrous. Daniel smiled faintly. "Nobody could have predicted this." Nathan laughed quietly. "No kidding." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Nathan spoke again. "You know what Lucas gave me?" Daniel looked over. Nathan's eyes glistened slightly in the fading sunlight. "A second chance." Daniel frowned gently. "Nathan." "No," Nathan interrupted softly. "I mean it." He leaned against the porch railing. "For years, I only remembered the people I couldn't save. I carried that guilt everywhere." He swallowed hard. "But Lucas reminded me that saving even one life matters, more than I realized." Daniel felt emotion tighten his throat. Nathan smiled toward the boys. "Because of him, Mason learned compassion instead of cruelty. Because of him, I got sober. Because of him," his voice cracked slightly, "I finally stopped hating myself." Daniel stared out at his son. The scars on Lucas's arms glowed pale beneath the setting sun as he laughed with his best friend. Scars. For years, Daniel had seen them as reminders of everything they lost. Now he saw something else. Survival, strength, connection. The wounds that once isolated Lucas from the world had unexpectedly led them toward people who understood their pain better than anyone else could. People who became family. Lucas suddenly ran toward the porch, breathlessly. "Dad, Mason says velociraptors are smarter than T-Rexes. Tell him he's wrong." Daniel laughed. "Oh, absolutely wrong." "Ha!" Lucas shouted triumphantly. Mason groaned dramatically from the yard. "Traitor!" Nathan shook his head, smiling. Then Lucas looked up at the adults, curiously. "What are you guys talking about?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Nathan before answering softly. "We were talking about scars." Lucas instinctively glanced down at his arms. For a brief moment, Daniel remembered the little boy sitting awake in bed, asking if he looked like a monster. Now Lucas simply smiled. Nathan crouched beside him. "You know what scars really are?" he asked gently. Lucas thought for a second. "What?" Nathan rested a hand carefully on the boy's shoulder. "Proof that you survived something hard and kept going anyway." Lucas considered that seriously before grinning. "Like battle damage." Nathan laughed warmly. "Exactly like battle damage." As the sun disappeared behind the trees and the boys returned to their imaginary dinosaur war, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because the pain was gone, not because the loss no longer mattered, but because they had finally learned something important. Sometimes the people who understand our deepest wounds are the same people who helped us survive them. And sometimes the scars we fear the most become the very things that lead us home.